Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney and CNBC's Washington Correspondent Eamon Javers.
Hello, everybody. I'm Eamon Javers with CNBC. Sorry to interrupt lunch. Please continue eating. I don't want to compete with a full plate of lunch.
I think we're competing with dessert, it looks like.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, Mick, thank you for being here. I know
and I apologize for being late this morning.
There's a lot going on. The president just left the White House on his way to Iowa a few minutes ago.
Yep.
Nancy Pelosi was here. She's the Speaker of the House.
Is she really? I've heard of her.
She said this morning that she's done with President Trump.
Is that what you said?
Is President Trump done with her?
Oh, wow. Did she really say that this morning?
She did, yep.
Did anybody press her on that or not?
Manu Raju from CNN was here on stage. He's a respected
I'm not sure.
correspondent.
Okay. No. I mean, we're not done with her, and I doubt she's done with us. Does that strike anybody strange that she come up and said she's done with him and not going to talk about him for the next 18 months?
Her point is that he takes up so much of everybody's mindset. Yeah. He distracts, he deflects. Everyone's talking about him constantly. She's saying, I'm just not going to talk about him anymore.
Okay. We'll see how that holds up. So, who wants to? Is everybody making book on that one as to how long that lasts or not? So, all right.
The president said he wasn't going to negotiate with Democrats anymore on infrastructure after
Yeah.
the last meeting with Pelosi, right?
Yeah.
Things didn't go well.
No, they didn't.
He came out and said, that's it, I'm done. He says, I'm not going to negotiate with them on infrastructure, but what will he negotiate with them on, right? There's a lot of big, important issues that you guys have to deal with together between now and the end of the year. So what's on the list that he will address?
Well, and thanks for raising that, because the very next day we negotiated with them. Right? The very next day, we negotiated with them on a disaster bill. Now, the disaster bill didn't actually get signed, I don't think, until last week. There was some objections to it being passed in the House without voting on it and so forth. So it was delayed in terms of when it actually became law. But the very next day, after the infrastructure meeting, we were working with them on how to figure out a way to solve the disaster bill. That will continue. We're going to have to talk to them about spending. I've talked about they're not going to pass a budget. By the way, you could do a nice story on that. The Democrats refusing, since this is the Peterson Institute, refusing to even take up a budget this year in the House. But we will have to work with them on the spending matters. So there's a bunch of stuff we'll do. It's just the infrastructure. I mean, go back to what happened that particular day. We had a pre-existing meeting on infrastructure that they had asked for, and we'd agreed to it. We had done some work on some things that we were going to propose. They had supposedly had six-page proposal that no one's seen yet, I don't think, that Schumer said he had, and no one's asked to see that yet. But they were going to show up, and we're going to have, I think, a lunchtime meeting. And that morning, she has an impromptu closed-door meeting with her caucus and walks out and says, I think President Trump has committed a crime. Now I'm going down to his house to have a meeting. That's just not, it's not human nature then to have that sort of lead to a conducive meeting on subject matter. So the outcome didn't surprise me. It shouldn't surprise anybody, but we started working with him on other stuff right away.
So what won't he work? I mean, let's put some limits around the walkout here. He walked out on infrastructure. Is that it?
Probably done. I think infrastructure probably is.
Anything else that he won't work with them on?
Well, I mean, right now we're trying to work with them on USMCA. So that's the better question: is will they work with us on the trade deal? I think everybody knows that it'll pass the Senate if it gets a vote. Everybody knows that it will pass the House today if it got a vote. Now, it would not get a majority of Democrats, so it raises the issue of will Nancy bring, Ms. Pelosi, will she bring a vote to the floor that doesn't have a majority of her majority? That's a really good question. That's a fair question. We dealt with that all the time when I was in the House. But the fact of the matter is there's sufficient votes in both chambers to make this law. So I guess the question is, against that backdrop, are they willing to work with us on this? So the question go back and forth. Are we willing to work with them on this? Are they willing to work with that on us? That's a standard question in Washington, D.C. Let's take it on a case-by-case basis. We just do wish that the USMCA could proceed because the votes are there. And I don't have to tell you folks, because I guess since you're here, you follow this fairly closely. Getting any major piece of legislation passed in this environment is very, very difficult to do. So if you have a piece of legislation that could do that on a bipartisan basis, why not? And really maybe the only argument is because it makes the president look good. Now, I can say that with a certain amount of credibility, I hope, because I was elected in 2010. And I will tell you, there were many members of my incoming class in 2011 who would never vote for anything that would have made Barack Obama look good. So I've seen this from the other side, okay? It's real. The question is that the right thing to do? Are the Democrats right to hold back on voting on something that's good for the country because they don't want the president to have success? I think that's a fair question to ask.
Let me ask you this one. Just a couple of minutes ago, while folks here, maybe just before dessert, the president walked out. He was on his way to Iowa. He was at the South Lawn talking to reporters. He held up a piece of paper.
He made news?
He made news at the South Lawn. My colleagues were on the South Lawn report. He held up a piece of paper and said that it is a secret agreement on trade with Mexico that the Mexicans have agreed to with him. Is there a secret agreement on trade, and what's in it?
I think the best, and I think the best way to describe it would sort of be as a backstop. They've agreed to do certain things. If you follow this fairly closely, you've seen the commitments they've made in terms of increasing their own. Actually, I think they're actually creating, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, but I think I read that they're actually creating a new entity, their National Reserve, to go down and do that, or the National Guard, I can't remember what they call it, and police their own southern border. Keep in mind, their southern border is about the quarter of the length of ours. So if they can keep the folks from Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador out of Mexico, it solves a lot of problems on our border. So by committing up to, I think, 6,000 troops to doing that, they're doing real things. They're going to commit to do interdiction, to intervene with some of the drug cartels that actually help ferry the people. So they're doing a bunch of things. And a backstop agreement, which is what I think we sort of refer to it, is if those things don't work, then they're going to help us with their asylum laws. Or with our asylum laws. So I think that's the best way to look at it. But let's hope that the first things, the things everybody knows about, work. Because they have this, right now, because of, and again, I know there's a lot of people in this room who didn't like the threats of tariffs. But let's be honest with each other. It got the Mexicans to do things they had never agreed to do in the past. And now I think our interests are aligned. They know they need to help us. We know we need them to help us, so if they can help us do it, and the backstop doesn't become relevant, that's fine.
But that was all in the communique and the open public documents about what was in this deal. What's in the secret part of the deal that the president's talking about now?
If I told you, it would be the secret part of the deal, right?
When are we going to find out?
Maybe never. Because if it works, it doesn't make a difference, right? It only becomes relevant if the other things.
We never find out what was in it.
If you don't need it. What's the purpose? The purpose here is not to satisfy your journalistic sort of, inquiries as to what the deal is. The goal is to reduce the number of people crossing the border. Keep in mind, I think most everybody agrees that this is an emergency situation. It is a humanitarian crisis at the border. And I can say that now because I think the New York Times has now done 2 op-eds saying that. One of which I think was entitled, "Give Trump His Money," which is something you'd never hear the New York Times say. But that's a far cry from where we were 6 months ago when Nancy Pelosi sat in the Situation Room and said to Kirstjen Nielsen, she said, "Here are the numbers on the number of people that crossed last night illegally." And she said, "I don't believe you. Those numbers are not right. You're making those numbers up." That was 6 months ago. Now here we are, and everybody agrees that we have a problem. So the goal is to fix the problem. If you don't have to tell you what difference does it make? If we fix the problem, we fix the problem.
But the United States has agreed to whatever the terms are in the secret deal. We've signed up for something as a country.
Yeah, again, it's something that will kick in if the other things don't work.
Right. And we'll find out.
Yeah.
Or not.
Keep in mind, our asylum laws, why did we have to go to Mexico? In large part because the Democrats wouldn't help us in the House. The Senate. It's been like 6 weeks now since I went down and met with 6 Senate leaders. And I thought we had a very productive meeting. And I went in and I said, look, I'm not here to try and solve DACA. We're not going to pretend to solve merit-based, but we have a situation on the border right now. Can you do some things to help us right now? Because this is the situation we have. If you have an unaccompanied child that comes across the border, okay, not someone who's separated from their parents, but an unaccompanied child comes across the border, DHS takes them into custody. I think they have 72 hours before they have to deliver them to an HHS facility. Okay? If the HHS facility is full, which it is, DHS is not allowed by law to send that child to that facility. DHS is also not allowed by law to send that child to a non-government organization. DHS is also not allowed by law to send that child back to their country of origin, and DHS is not allowed by law to send that child back to Mexico. So I ask you, what are they supposed to do with that child? And the answer is, I have no idea. Okay? And we went to the Senate, went to the Democrats specifically, and said, please just solve this. Do something temporary. Give us 3 months. Give us 6 months to solve this problem. They said, this is a real serious problem, and immediately left for 2 weeks on vacation. Okay? That's what we're dealing with. And so you've got that up here on the Hill, the fact that you're going to a foreign country and maybe playing some cards that you haven't played in the past, trying to impose tariffs, for example, shouldn't surprise anybody. If you really believe that what's on the border needs to be fixed, that all of this makes sense. If you're not really concerned about it, then you think we're crazy. But if you really believe that there's a problem, all we're doing is trying to do everything that we know to do to fix it.
So let's talk about the subject of the day, the national debt. When the president took office, gross national debt was something around 19.9 trillion.
Yeah.
Today, what is it, 22 trillion?
Something like that. Yeah.
You guys have been cutting revenue, increasing spending.
No, that first part's not true. Revenues are up.
Well, cutting taxes.
Cutting
increasing
taxes,
spending.
that's true. Yeah.
Right. So the question for you, Mick Mulvaney, is: are you still a deficit hawk?
Yeah. Let's. I mean, this is the Peterson Institute. By the way, you guys do some great work. We still use your data all of the time. Thank you for keeping these issues on the forefront. I was a big admirer of this group when I was in the House. We still use them when I was at OMB, and I'm here today, obviously, for the same reason. We are not going to cut our way to balance. And I'm looking at Maya, and I know she's cringing to hear me say this, but you're just not going to do it. Okay? Show me the majority in the House to vote to cut spending. Show me the 60-vote majority in the Senate to vote to cut spending. Okay? That's not going to happen. And you say, oh, Mr. Mulvaney, you have to sign the appropriations bill, so the president's responsible for this too. I know if we don't sign the appropriations bills, what happens? Government shuts down, and then everybody yells at us to open the government again, right? So that's the little game that we play. There is no center of gravity to reduce spending in this town, period, end of story. In fact, I don't think there ever has been. When you go back to the late 90s, when they supposedly balanced the budget, and of course anybody who follows it closely knows that really didn't happen. They used the surplus from Social Security to sort of create the balance, but we're close to a surplus back in the late 90s. We did not do it by cutting spending. We did it by reducing the growth of spending during a boom time when revenues could catch up. And that's what we're shooting for now. We're trying to figure out a way to grow our revenues faster than our expenses. We didn't do a very good job on that in the first couple of years, but again, when you don't have active partners on the Hill, it's very difficult for the administration to do this by itself. Go look at our budgets. I know people say they're always dead on arrival, but at least they should count for something, which is if the president were in charge, this is what we'd do. Okay? Three now of the most fiscally responsible budgets that have ever been drafted by administration of either party, up to and including, we get a lot of criticism from the right for doing this, up to and including the largest single entitlement savings ever, without touching mainline Social Security and without touching mainline Medicare. How did we do that? Raise your hand if you know that your Medicare taxes go to pay graduate medical school tuition. Okay? You folks in this room, that's actually much better than average. Okay?
These people are very well informed.
Yeah, keep in mind that these pots of money, Social Security and Medicare were pots of money for a long time with a lot of dough in them. And a lot of lawmakers in both parties had really, really good ideas on programs they wanted to fund, and they saw that pot of money and said, well, you know, I guess graduate medical school tuition is sort of related to Medicare, so doesn't it make sense to take money out of that pot to pay? I know that paying bad debts, non-Medicare bad debts at private hospitals isn't associated with Medicare, but let's go in and take that out of the pot of money as well, which we do. And we fixed all of that, or at least we proposed to fix all of that in our budget. It led to the largest savings in mandatory spending out of any budget in history. So we get it.
So
we need a partner to do it.
You've said in the past, though, that the way to do this is not through spending cuts. You learned that.
Yeah.
The way to do it is through growth. And
Yeah.
so at the GDP growth that we have now, is that enough to grow our way out of our fiscal problem?
I can't. It's been a long time since I did the math on this because it's been a while. It's been 6 months now. It's been at OMB, but I cannot remember what happens if you get 3% growth for 10 years instead of 2% growth for 10 years. The amount of money. Matt, you remember what the number is? It's astonishing. It's $1 trillion less in debt, $1 trillion more in revenue, that kind of stuff.
Right.
That's the power of compound interest over the period of time.
Are you comfortable that we're hitting that sweet spot, or we will?
Well, listen, three is what we think is achievable. Do we think we could have done a little bit better last year? Yeah. Do we think the Fed intervened a little bit early? Yeah, we really do. And I know the president gets some criticism for that. But keep in mind, what's the dual mandate at the Federal Reserve? Number one, and I don't like the dual mandate, but it is the law, full employment and price stability. Okay? We had full employment, and we had no inflation. Why do you raise interest rates under those circumstances? So we think we could have done better last year, but we still think the fundamentals are strong. The small business confidence numbers, I think, came out yesterday or today. They were good. We do not think this was a short-time sugar rush. We can talk about that. We think we made some structural changes to the way we create and thus tax wealth in this country, and we think that this is a sustainable growth period.
You bring up the Fed. When was the last time the president talked to Jay Powell at the Fed?
I have no idea.
You don't know how often he picks up the phone and talks to him directly?
Nope.
Because he's not afraid to rattle his cage.
Yeah.
Right? He's not afraid to say
I think
stuff.
Mnuchin meets with him
tweet,
once a week
tweet.
or once a month, but that's a tradition between the Secretary of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. So that's ordinary course
Is
of
this
business.
president eroding that sense of an independent Fed that's immune from political interference?
Anybody read Paul Volcker's book? So anybody in this room? There's a chapter, and there's I can't remember who the chief of staff was at the time. It may have been Jim Baker, was it? Called Volcker into the chief of staff's office and said, "Let me make one thing perfectly clear, Paul. The President of the United States is telling you to cut interest rates." Is that really that different than what's happening now? I mean, that's not at all unusual for a president of either party to want a Federal Reserve chairman to be a little more accommodating when it comes to monetary policy.
Have you said that to Jay Powell?
No, I don't think I've ever talked to Jay. So, no. I mean, I'm sure I have when I was on the Hill because he testified before the committee, so technically I probably talked to him, but I've not talked to him in official capacity since I've been in this job.
How long do you think the United States can sustain trillion-dollar annual deficits?
I don't know.
How many years in the
I mean,
future
I've been saying 6 years we can't do it. I don't know. I would like to think it's not forever. I tell people we're going to balance the budget eventually. Yeah, well, you're going to balance the budget eventually, right? Because either you balance it on your own terms or on other people's terms. People will stop lending you money. But I do not know the answer. All I know is I don't want to try it any longer than we absolutely have to. But again, Congress appropriates the money. And when both parties are interested in increasing spending, it's tough to be an administration to lead on fiscal conservatism.
Let's go back to the tariffs for a minute, because the president seems to have really embraced them to solve a range of foreign policy problems, not just to bring people to the table, as he suggested. So the question is, does the outcome of the Mexico negotiations, which the president says is a huge success, and there's a secret part to it that we don't know about, does that embolden the president in terms of dealing with the Chinese and Xi Jinping? A lot of people are looking ahead to Osaka and the G20 and trying to figure out whether we're going to get a deal there. Does Mexico make the president more likely to take a hard line with Xi, or more likely to cut a deal?
I think that's a really good question. So let me make news then, I guess. I think it probably emboldens him to take a tougher stance. But that shouldn't surprise anybody. What did the president do when it came to Mexico? He tried to figure out a way to get our interests aligned, right? To get their own enlightened self-interest to want to help us with this problem. Keeping in mind, I can't remember what the percentage is, but the overwhelming majority of people who are now crossing the southern border are not Mexican. They are not Mexican. They come from the northern triangle countries, which means that they're using Mexico as a conduit to get to the U.S., and Mexico was doing nothing about it because we couldn't convince them that it was in their interest to do so. The threat of tariffs changed that calculation. I think that same analysis applies to the China negotiations, which is it's hurting them more than it's hurting us. And does the president feel like we have the opportunity to create a really good agreement with the Chinese? Yes. Do we need to? Yes. I cannot tell you the number of times I've been meeting with, and I won't use any names, which I know disappoints you, but I've been down with my former colleagues, mostly senators, because senators just mostly, I'm a House guy, and there's just a natural dislike anyway between the House and the Senate. But I'll be in with the Democrat leaders in the Senate, and they'll say, you know what, Mulvaney, I can't stand working with you on this, 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 and this. But you tell the president what he's doing on China is right. Okay? I fully expect that whoever the Democrat nominee is for president, they will be running on a harsher position on China than we are. Because everybody knows you have to do it. And you have to. You should have done it 20 years ago, but we didn't. Okay? If you don't do it now, it's not going to get done. There was I think that one of the folks who ran the rare earths thing had a great quote, which is if we can't do it now, who's going to? I mean, put yourself in the position of somebody who's trying to do business in China. You have to give away part of your business to the Chinese government, in essence. You have to give them a lot of your intellectual property, and once you don't give them, they could steal. That's not a healthy long-term relationship. We have to fix the problem, and the president gets that. He is not looking at this. I know this will fall on deaf ears to some people. He is not looking for short-term political gain on this one. He really does believe that this is an existential issue. You have to fix the relationship with China now. And when we really do believe this, it's in China's interest to do so. There's no other first world developed country that makes me give them my IP when I come in to work in the country. If they want to join the family of nations that lead the world, they have to change their standards. This is the opportunity for them to do so. So I think, if anything, to answer your question, I think it just reaffirms in the president's mind that this is the right thing to do at the right time, and he's going to stick it out.
You talked about tariffs hurting them more than they're hurting us.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the hurting us piece of it for a minute. The president's been talking a lot about who's paying the tariffs. So I just want to clarify this.
Yeah.
Who's writing the checks on these tariffs?
Whoever imports them signs the checks.
So American companies.
Right.
Often.
But go to the next. What's your next? Follow it down the ladder.
Well, the next question is, why doesn't the president say that?
Well, because how do you tell if prices are going up? How do you tell if consumers are actually paying it?
If consumers are paying it,
Yeah.
I'm talking about the importers, though. The people who are writing those checks are companies inside the United States,
No.
correct?
The charge has always been this is a tax on the American people. That the individual consumers are paying this, right? That's always been the challenge. That prices will go up. Prices have not gone up. There's no inflation. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. I know. My degree is in economics. I can make the case.
But it's a tax on somebody. And the people who are being taxed are inside the United States.
All right. So if I'm an American company and I have to make 5% profit margins to do it, and I can't raise my prices, that's fine. What am I doing? I'm negotiating with my seller to lower the price. And that's where a lot of this burden is being borne, either through outright price reductions by the Chinese companies, or more commonly by the depreciation of the value of their currency. And these are you can go look at.
The Chinese are paying the tariffs, right? And that's not true.
If you are depreciating your currency, you are paying it. If you have $10 in your wallet right now, and I depreciate the currency, it's now worth $9. Who paid for that? You did. No. Again, I understand the orthodoxy. I get the economics. It makes sense, right? It does on a piece of paper. But in the real world, where it's fairly easy to substitute goods and fairly easy to move the means of production, that maybe some of the old-fashioned sort of all other things being equal analysis on tariffs don't apply. And certainly you've seen some evidence of that in the real world, because the prices have not gone up.
And you're convinced that's going to force the Chinese
I'm convinced
to make
it's
this
happening.
deal?
I'm convinced it's happening.
Where else is the president going to use this tool?
He's
talked about it as a tool to negotiate on trade. Now he's talking about it as a tool to negotiate on immigration. Is it a tool to negotiate, say, on NATO funding or other things that the president wants? I mean, are we talking about, he's mentioned French wine, German cars. Are they coming next?
I think the president, he's not been shy about this. He perceives a bunch of different trade arrangements, whether or not free trade agreements or different understandings we have with other countries, as not being fair, not being level playing field for the U.S. And I think it's fair to say that he'd use whatever tools he could to try and negotiate better deals.
But we don't.
Why would you ask him to take that one off the table, especially when it comes to trade?
Look, the president seems to have been able to get people to come to the table and talk to him in a way that is new. I was asking a former Mexican diplomat about this just the other day. Why is it that the Mexicans even came to the table, right? And the president's argument is that the tariffs bring them to the table. And I guess my question for you is, do the tariffs, are they enough to get the deal done, or do you have to do something else? Do you have to offer concessions as well?
I mean, we could sit here and pontificate all we want. Here's the facts of the matter, okay? We're in the office, I think it's a Thursday, or a Friday afternoon. Maybe it was a Friday afternoon. And the president says, put out a thing, says we're going to raise tariffs 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, right? Because I wrote it up. In fact, I went on the Sunday shows that day to defend him. Mexicans were here by Tuesday.
Right.
And stayed until there was a deal. Coincidence? I don't know. But that's actually what happened. So, take credit for it, criticize it, but that's actually what happened. You decide for yourself whether or not those two things are causally related.
Let me ask you about a remarkable moment that happened on CNBC yesterday.
Just one?
Just one.
Was this involve you?
No, it involved the president, actually. So the president was on responding to some comments from the United States Chamber of Commerce. And this was fascinating to me to watch a Republican president deeply criticize the Chamber of Commerce, which has been very closely linked with the Republican Party for my entire lifetime. The president said that the Chamber of Commerce values companies more than it values the country, and said he's considering resigning his membership in the Chamber of Commerce because of that. So my question is, do you agree with that? Do you agree that the Chamber of Commerce values companies more than it values?
I was traveling this weekend. I was in a gymnasium in St. Paul, Minnesota on Monday morning, and I'm sitting there and I'm working out. I'm looking and I'm watching CNBC, because I do. And the president called into, what's his name, Kernan? Joe Kernan's office. I'm like, that's not on the schedule. So, and so I watched it, and I thought, listen, this is the president being the president. It's one of the great things I like about working with him is it's spontaneous like that. He was probably watching the show and saw some story about the chamber.
Yeah.
And I think if anybody still thinks the president is going to be a traditional Democrat or a traditional Republican, you haven't been paying attention for the last 2.5 years. And if the Chamber of Commerce comes out and says something he disagrees with, he's going to let everybody know about it. This should not make news. at this point. He's very candid about that, and he is not afraid of ruffling feathers. He's not afraid of offending traditional Republican supporters or of saying nice things about traditional Democrat supporters. The folks who agree with his policies, he's going to agree with. The folks who attack him, he's going to fight back. So it didn't surprise me at all. At the end of the day, I mean, these are advocacy groups, right? And they get paid to advocate for their membership. One of the most depressing but most favorite lines about that is back when the National Education Association was founded in the 1960s. They asked the president of the association, this is the teachers union, they did an hour-long interview on a news program. At the end of the interview, they asked him, they said, well, what, on your agenda, you haven't talked anything about students. And the president of the union said, well, we'll worry about students when they join the union. So, I mean, this is what those types of groups do. Anyway, the president disagreed. President let everybody know disagree, and we'll go from there.
I mean, remarkable in American politics, though, because in the past several election cycles, you've had one candidate or the other who pretty much mirrors the Chamber of Commerce line down the line in terms of free markets, trade, and American business. In this next cycle, though, you've got the president, who, as you say, is not a traditional Democrat or Republican on this. You might have a very left-leaning Democratic nominee, depending on how that all shakes out on that side. Is it possible that we'll have no free market Chamber of Commerce type candidate in the 2020 presidential election?
You'll have different degrees. Okay, just because the president attacked the Chamber of Commerce doesn't mean that he and the Chamber of Commerce won't agree on 90% of things. They just disagreed on the 10% that he talked about yesterday. I mean, the Chamber was a huge supporter of the tax bill, and rightly so. A huge supporter of what we're trying to do on USMCA, and rightly so. So I think the president just calls them like he sees them.
So let's talk a little bit about Democrats and calling it like you see it. We're talking about what they're going to negotiate on. What is the plan to get Democrats and Republicans to work together on the debt ceiling this year? You've got a limited amount of time to figure that out. Negotiations, as we've seen, tend to blow up in dramatic fashion. Markets are watching this very carefully.
Yeah.
Is there a plan?
Is a plan. There's not a sort of a step-by-step, we're doing this week, we're doing this next week, but the negotiations and discussions have already started. I've done 2 or 3 of them already. So our group is myself, Secretary Mnuchin, the Vice President, and Russell Vogt, who's the acting OMB director. And of course, obviously, then there's the leaders on the Hill and so forth. But we've met 2 or 3 times. We thought we're making some progress. And it had one of those sinking feelings that you have sometime in politics where you're making some progress at a meeting and someone gets a phone call and they step out of the meeting and they come back and all of a sudden you've taken 3 steps backwards. That's fine. It's happened to me with both parties. It's not surprising. It's just a little disappointing what happened. That happened. But that's fine. We've got a lot of time left to deal with that. And the discussions are going on. I talked to Mitch McConnell today about the appropriations process. Vice President speaking to the Republicans in the Senate right now. And that topic is going to come up as well. So we're aware of it. I mean, we know what's out there. We know it has to get done. We know it will get done. There's really only one discussion, and it's really the one I know that probably interests you folks the most, which is what's the spending level? Is it X, which would be last year minus something, Y, which would be the exact same as last year? Would it be Y plus inflation or Y plus something else? That's what the negotiation is right now.
They only gave us a half an hour for this, which for me is fabulous because I normally get 1:30.
Yeah.
We've got 3 minutes left. So let me do a quick lightning round of things that might or might not happen between now and the end of the year, which are on the agenda. Government funding deal.
Yes, absolutely.
Reauthorize Export-Import Bank.
Yes, probably.
Defense sequester decision.
Well, defense sequester decision goes with the funding.
Right,
you get a funding deal, the sequester goes away.
So you're
there'll be no
hoping to get rid of the sequester.
I do not think
no
there'll be a
what.
defensive. Yeah, I think those two go together.
Reauthorize FISA.
Ooh, good question.
That's out of left field.
No, it will be, but the question is,
the president's been very critical of FISA.
He has been, and I was fairly critical of FISA was in the House, so I understand where the president's coming from on this. So I give it a pretty good chance of being reauthorized because it can be and is a valuable tool, but I think you may see a couple more protections for individual liberties tacked on.
Full-time Secretary of Defense. We've got an acting Secretary of Defense now.
That's up to the Senate. I mean, we've named the guy, right?
So at some point this year, we'll have no longer an acting
That's a question for Mitch McConnell.
Secretary of Defense. And then last question
let's
for
put
you.
this. I very much hope so, and I think they probably they will. Listen, the Senate is not going to dally on a Secretary of Defense. It's the ambassadors to Lithuania that we probably need to. We still got, I think, 200 people pending. Think about that. Our party's in charge of the Senate, and we have several hundred people who are simply waiting for a vote. That's very frustrating, I won't lie to you.
Last question for you, speaking of acting. You are the acting White House Chief of Staff.
How am I doing?
Will you serve as acting Chief of Staff or full-time Chief of Staff in a second Trump administration?
Here's the deal on that. Everybody says, oh, you're acting. It actually makes a difference when it is a Senate-confirmed position. So there's technically a legal difference between an acting Secretary of Defense and a Senate-confirmed Secretary of Defense. There is no difference between an acting Chief of Staff and a regular Chief of Staff. And I use it as an excuse to just tell everybody who works for me on the staff that we work at the will of the president. We could show you could make me the permanent Chief of Staff tomorrow, and you could fire me on Thursday. Or you could leave me as the acting Chief of Staff, and I could stay to the second term. It doesn't make any difference.
So you would stay to the second term if asked?
Oh yeah, and I'll stay as long as I feel like he values my opinion, and I like working for him. And both those things are happening right now.
Mick Mulvaney,
Look at that,
thanks so
7
much for your time.
That's not bad. Thanks, Eamon.
Thanks, appreciate it. Fascinating conversation. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the Peterson Foundation.